Rome feared neither gods nor barbarians, but one day it grew afraid of a slave. Spartacus was never meant to leave a mark on history. He was simply one of thousands, shackled, sold, and forgotten. His place was the arena. His role was to die beautifully. But he chose a different path. He escaped, and at first dozens followed him, then thousands, until a whole army marched in his wake. What was it? A doomed rebellion? A war for freedom? Or a moment of madness that forced Rome to retreat? In this video, you will learn where Spartacus came from and how he became a gladiator, how the rebellion that swept across Italy began, why Rome couldn't stop it immediately, and how this story ended in crucifixion, silence, and immortality. They tried to erase the name of Spartacus, but the more they tried to forget him, the more powerfully he transformed into a legend. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Stories for Sleep are published here daily.
Rome and slaves, a world on the edge. In the middle of the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was experiencing not only prosperity, but also deep internal tensions that had been building for years. After a series of conquests, its power stretched from the coasts of Spain to the borders of Asia Minor. And at the heart of this vast state beat an economic engine built on the labor of those who had no rights, slaves. Every victory of the Roman legions meant a new wave of prisoners. They were sold in markets, distributed to villas, and sent to workshops, mines, quarries, and agricultural estates. In Italy at that time, slaves made up roughly a third of the population, and even more in some regions. They were not citizens, had no legally recognized families, could not own property, appeal to the courts, and most importantly, were not considered fully human. Roman law viewed them as property, and a master had the absolute right to sell, beat, torture, or even kill his slave without consequence. Slaves were not a homogeneous mass. Some were born into slavery, others captured in battle, some sold to settle debts. Among them were educated Greeks, skilled in medicine and philosophy, alongside captured barbarians who barely knew Latin. Some worked in the homes of Roman patricians, teaching their children and managing households. Others, stripped of all hope, died day by day in quarries and mines, rarely living past 40. A special place in this system was reserved for gladiators, slaves turned into fighters for public entertainment. Unlike the rest, they received food, shelter, medical care, and even fame. But all of this came at a price. Their bodies belonged to the spectacle. The arena fights and amphitheaters were more than just entertainment. They served as a reminder to society of Rome's power and the fate of its enemies. They are forced to fight to the death for the amusement of others. A gladiator could not refuse to fight. He was trained, fed, clad in heavy armor, and paraded before a jubilant crowd. Some fighters were born in Italy, but most were slaves captured on the fringes of the empire. They were trained in special schools called ludi, where conditions were brutal. One such school, and by no means the least significant, was in Capua, run by Lentulus Batiatus, a wealthy, influential, and ruthless man. Capua was known as a place where a slave was forged into a warrior. There, new rivals learned to wield various weapons: the short sword, the spear, the net. They were taught combat techniques, tactics, and endurance. The school was organized almost like an army, but with one key difference. These soldiers had no cause, no country, no flag. They were property, a capital investment, a means of profit. Some died in training, others in the arenas. A third group died in dungeons for breaking the rules. Against the backdrop of this inhumane yet familiar machinery, discontent slowly simmered. Local outbreaks of violence were becoming more frequent in Italy. Fugitives hid in the mountains. Overseers were killed in some regions. Rumors of revolts spread through the cities. However, the Senate and the people of Rome saw this as peripheral noise, minor disturbances incapable of threatening the system itself. The authorities were confident. Slaves might rebel, but they could never unite. Gladiators could fight, but only against each other. There could be no organized threat, for they had no weapons, no allies, no leaders. It is here that the story of this video begins. The story of a man who found himself among the gladiators of Capua but refused to accept his fate. The story of those who refused to be a spectacle. The story of those who dared to believe that chains could not only be broken, but forged into swords. And before the first name is spoken, before the whips crack over the arena and the chains rattle in escape, it is important to understand. Rome in those years existed in a fragile balance. It was great, but vulnerable. It held everything under control, but failed to notice the cracks. It laughed at the slaves, and one day awoke in fear when one of them picked up a knife.
The origins of Spartacus. The story of Spartacus begins far beyond Rome, in the rugged, wild lands the Romans called Thrace. It was not a unified country, but a mosaic of tribes living between the Danube and Hebrus rivers, at the foot of the Rhodope Mountains, and on the shores of the Black Sea. The Thracians were warriors, hunters, and horsemen. They wore tattoos, worshipped gods of war and wind, and performed bloody sacrifices. Their neighbors, the Greeks, Macedonians, and later the Romans, viewed them with caution. On one hand, they were barbarians. On the other, they were perfect soldiers. Almost nothing is known about Spartacus's youth. Neither his exact date of birth, his native tribe, nor his father's name have reached us. The only thing ancient authors agree on is that he was a Thracian. He was likely born in the central Rhodopes or closer to the Hebrus Valley among the Mede tribe, known for their tenacity and warrior culture. It's quite probable that from an early age he knew how to wield a spear, hunt, and fight on horseback. Such qualities were highly valued in Rome, and it's no surprise that many Thracians were recruited into the auxiliary units of the Roman army. There is speculation that Spartacus served in such an Roman auxiliary unit, not as a legionary, but as an ally whose duty was to participate in campaigns as a junior partner. Perhaps he distinguished himself in battle, perhaps he broke discipline, or perhaps he simply became inconvenient to his commander. The exact reasons remain unknown, but the result is clear. He was accused of desertion, captured, and sold into slavery. Thus began his second life, not as a Thracian warrior, but as a commodity on the Roman market. His physical prowess, endurance, and combat experience did not go unnoticed. At one of the markets, likely in Neapolis or Nola, he was spotted by a representative of the gladiator school in Capua. And so he ended up in the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus. Capua, located south of Rome, was one of Italy's wealthiest and most decadent cities. Trade, luxury, and above all gladiatorial spectacles flourished there. Lentulus Batiatus owned a school housing dozens of fighters. Each underwent training. They were taught not only to fight, but to die spectacularly, making an impression on the public. The school was walled and guarded by armed sentries. Escape seemed impossible. Spartacus quickly stood out. According to Plutarch, he was distinguished by his intelligence, restraint, and unusual physical strength. He was not crude, did not boast, and did not rush into battle without reason. He observed, remembered, and drew conclusions. This was noticed by both his fellow slaves and the overseers. He was respected by those who lived beside him, and feared by those who held him. A particularly interesting episode recounted by Plutarch involves a prophecy. When Spartacus first arrived in Capua, his Thracian wife, who had been taken captive with him, dreamed of a snake coiled around his neck. She interpreted this as a sign of a great destiny, that the gods had chosen him for something greater. Even in Roman tradition, such dreams were taken seriously. Whether legend or not, it reflects how Spartacus was viewed even in his lifetime, as a man with something special about him. Conditions at the school were harsh. The trainees were beaten, forced to train for hours. The slightest disobedience was punished, sometimes by death. Weapons were issued only for training and fights. In daily life, gladiators didn't even have a knife.
Supervision was strict, food meager, the atmosphere tense. And yet here, amidst despair and fatigue, a small, almost impossible thing began to take shape: a secret alliance. Among the gladiators were men willing to take the risk. Some were former soldiers captured in battle, others naturally rebellious. Spartacus became the center of this group not because he was the loudest advocate for escape, but because he knew how to listen and calculate. He understood that a spontaneous revolt would lead to death. But if they prepared, chose the right moment, and secured support, they could try to break free. Soon he was joined by two men worth mentioning separately, Crixus and Onymos. Both were also gladiators, slaves with no way back. Together with Spartacus, they began preparing an escape, slowly, cautiously, step by step, in secret from the overseers. They were waiting for the right moment, but it would come not as planned, not during a scheduled uprising, but by accident, when their conspiracy was on the verge of exposure. And yet, even in that chaotic night, Spartacus's key quality would shine through: the ability to act quickly, make decisions, and take responsibility. But that is for the next chapter. For now, the important thing is this: Spartacus was not just a slave. He was a man with a past, a soldier, a husband, a Thracian. He knew the meaning of honor, and that is precisely why he could not accept chains as his fate. In a school designed to break the will, he preserved his own and became the man who would change the entire history of slavery in Rome.
The escape from Capua. The spark of rebellion. Spring 73 BC. The school of Lentulus Batiatus was gripped by its usual tension. Each day brought training, punishment, mockery, and brutal exercises. But beneath this surface of habitual order, something was brewing that would soon become one of the most famous rebellions in Roman history. The conspiracy had been developing for some time, but not all were immediately resolved to act. Fear was too strong. The guards, the walls, the lack of weapons, spies among their own ranks. Any mistake meant not just death, but public execution. The escape was planned for a few days later. Under cover of night, when some of the guards would be relaxed, the conspirators intended to seize the armory, free the others, and break out. But, as often happens in history, chance intervened and changed everything. Someone talked. Perhaps a new gladiator, unprepared for rebellion, grew frightened and informed. Perhaps someone simply let it slip. It's still unknown how the information leaked, but the result is clear. The school's administration learned that something was afoot. Security was tightened, guards were doubled, searches became more frequent, suspicions harsher. In such conditions, waiting was no longer an option. Any delay meant the conspirators would soon be led out for execution. So, without waiting for nightfall, the gladiators decided to act. They were unarmed. All they managed to acquire were knives, spits, and kitchen tools stolen from the kitchen. But even this was enough to break down the first door. The attack was swift. Spartacus, Crixus, and Onymos, and several other experienced fighters led the main assault. They struck first, quickly and without hesitation. The school, accustomed to order and obedience, was unprepared for such a sharp, coordinated attack. The guards were overwhelmed, the gates smashed. Some slaves, frightened and confused, remained inside, but about 70 men broke out and disappeared into the nearby forests. This near-chaotic moment became the beginning of the rebellion. What started as an escape very quickly became something more. To flee meant to hide, to hope for a miracle. To rebel meant to fight, gather allies, and change the course of history. From the very beginning, Spartacus chose the latter. Once free, he immediately sought a strategic refuge.
That place became Mount Vesuvius, towering over Campania. Its slopes were sparsely populated, the terrain difficult to traverse, and the summit offered a view of the surrounding area. Here they could rest, gather strength, and plan their next moves. The group that escaped from Capua climbed the mountain trails, occupied advantageous positions, and began to fortify themselves. This was the first deliberate decision, not of fugitives, but of field commanders. While Rome remained inactive, rumors spread quickly. In villages and settlements, among shepherds and farmhands, runaway slaves began to appear. Some had heard of the escape, some knew one of the gladiators. Within weeks, dozens, then hundreds joined the ranks. They were a diverse lot: former slaves, deserters, oppressed peasants. They were united by one thing: hatred for Rome and the hope that now they had a chance. But Rome would not sit idly by. Praetor Claudius Glaber was sent to suppress the rebellion with a force of 3,000 soldiers. His task seemed simple: surround the group of fugitives trapped on the mountain's summit and eliminate them. He was confident in victory. After all, this was not an army, but a rabble. However, what happened next forever changed how the Romans perceived Spartacus. The blockade seemed reliable. All approaches to Vesuvius were blocked, sentries posted, scouts dispatched. But Spartacus proposed a plan that demonstrated not only his cunning, but incredible boldness. He ordered his men to weave ropes from wild vines and use them to descend the steep cliff on the side the Romans least expected. At night, in complete silence, the detachment descended, outflanked the Romans, and attacked their camp from the rear. The assault was lightning fast. Glaber, caught off guard, suffered a crushing defeat. The fugitives not only broke the siege, but captured weapons, provisions, and armor. From that moment on, they ceased to be mere runaways. Now they had armaments, battle experience, and a victory. Most importantly, they had faith that they could stand against Rome. This victory was a signal. Soon new detachments flocked to Spartacus. Over the following weeks, their numbers doubled. Some came with pitchforks, some with stones, some empty-handed. Yet each was ready to fight. The army grew, and with it, the threat to the Republic. But ahead lay not only victories. The larger the army became, the harder it was to organize. Disagreements began to surface. Some simply wanted to break out of Italy and head north, others craved revenge and plunder. But for now, Spartacus maintained discipline, and everything remained under control. The path to legend was open, and for the first time, Rome felt it had lost not just a battle, but its advantage. It understood a real war lay ahead.
The peak of the rebellion. By the summer of 72 BC, Spartacus's rebellion had reached its zenith. After the death of Crixus and a scattering of some forces in southern Italy, he managed to retain control over the remainder of the army, restore order, and once again make his movement organized. This was no longer a spontaneous mob wandering from town to town. It was a real army, subject to discipline, divided into units, supplied with weapons, baggage trains, guards, and a cap structure. It numbered around 70,000 people. The exact figure is unknown, but ancient sources speak of colossal scale. Among the fighters were former gladiators, runaway slaves, deserters, and simple peasants deprived of their land, people of various nations and languages. They were united by one desire: to live without chains. And at the center of it all was Spartacus. He wore no crown, proclaimed himself no king, but it was to him they turned for orders. It was in him they believed. It was he they followed. During this time, he won several convincing victories. First, over proconsul Lucius Gellius, who, emboldened by his success against Crixus, decided to strike at Spartacus, only to have his legions repelled with heavy losses. Then over consul Publius Varenus. Varenus tried to cut off the rebels' path north, but Spartacus led his army through mountain passes and struck his flank. Varenus fled, leaving the rebels with stores of weapons and provisions. Rome was thrown into confusion. An army of slaves was not just surviving, it was winning. This was unprecedented. The Senate urgently intensified the recruitment of new legions. Panic began to spread in Rome. Some noble families left the capital, fearing an advance. The road to Rome was open. After the victory over the consuls, Spartacus was just a few days' march from the Eternal City. At this moment, he had everything: an army, moral superiority, and a fear paralyzing the enemy. And then arose the question that remains debated to this day. Why did he not march on Rome? Many contemporaries, and almost all later observers, could not understand this decision. What could be more logical to press forward when the enemy is in retreat? Why not capture the city, overthrow the Senate, and end the system that spawned slavery? There are several answers, each likely containing a part of the truth. First, Spartacus was not just a leader, but a strategist. He understood that taking Rome was not a battle, but a siege. And a siege required more than enthusiasm. It needed catapults, battering rams, ladders, and engineers. His army had no siege engines or experience in urban warfare. Even if he breached the walls, holding the city would be impossible. Rome would regroup its legions and strike from the flanks. Second, not everyone in the army wanted to march on Rome. Most were simple people dreaming only of one thing: to leave, to return home, to disappear into the mountains, fields, and forests. They had no plan for building a new state. They were not fighting for a throne, but for the chance to live. And Spartacus likely sensed this mood and did not want to push his people into a slaughter for which they were unprepared. Third, perhaps he simply was not a conqueror. His goal from the beginning was not the destruction of Rome, but liberation. He did not want to become a new dictator. He wanted to leave. And so, after all the victories, he once again began moving toward the Alps. Some sources report that he reached northern Italy, almost to the very passes. The border was near. Freedom was within reach. He could have sent his people home, could have disappeared himself. And perhaps he did release some, but he himself did not leave. Why? One version suggests the army refused to leave Italy. People who had tasted victory and splendor did not want to become fugitives again. Others believe the route back was cut off, the Alps guarded, supplies threatened. Or perhaps Spartacus himself realized that now, with so many fallen behind him, retreat was not a path to freedom, but an admission of defeat. Whatever the reason, he turned back and began moving south again. This was the beginning of the end. Because Rome had already drawn its conclusions. The war against the rebellion was no longer considered a secondary matter. The Senate gave full authority to one of the most ambitious politicians of the time, Marcus Licinius Crassus.
Against Crassus and Pompey. By the autumn of 72 BC, Spartacus's rebellion had become the greatest internal crisis in the history of the Roman Republic. An army of slaves, having defeated force after force, had nearly reached the Alps. Emergency Senate meetings were held. Senators argued over who was to blame, but the main question was whom to send to finally end it. Victories over praetors and consuls were a disgrace to Rome, and another failure was unthinkable. The choice fell upon Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was not the most popular, but Rome saw in him the man who would solve the problem not with words, but with actions. Crassus was one of the richest men of his time, having amassed his wealth through real estate speculation, profiting from others' misfortunes. He was respected not for his morals, but for his efficiency. Given command, he turned the war against Spartacus into a personal campaign. This was his chance not only to restore order, but to earn the political glory that would open the path to the highest power. Crassus did not repeat his predecessor's mistakes. He started by imposing iron discipline on his own army, which had been weakened by defeats and fear of the rebels. He made it clear that cowardice would not be tolerated.
In one legion that had retreated in a previous skirmish, he carried out decimation, the brutal punishment where every 10th soldier was beaten to death by his comrades. This ancient, nearly forbidden measure was revived with cold calculation. Fear returned, but now on the right side. Simultaneously, he began building fortified camps, supplied the legions, and organized constant reconnaissance. He did not seek a quick battle. He prepared for a war of attrition. He understood that Spartacus's army was strong in movement, surprise, and maneuver. Therefore, it had to be stripped of these advantages. The clash had to occur on Crassus's terms. Spartacus saw that he faced a new kind of opponent, not an ambitious official or a cowardly consul, but a man who knew how to wait, calculate, and strike precisely. The first clashes showed that Crassus was in no hurry. He cut off routes, blocked roads, intercepted supply trains, and starved the rebels of resources. Spartacus began looking for a way out. He attempted to revive an old plan, to leave Italy by sea from Brundisium, cross to the Balkans, to Thrace, where he was born, where his army could disappear among the mountains and peoples beyond Roman control. Perhaps it was then that he contacted the Cilician pirates, either through intermediaries or directly, promising gold and plunder. According to some accounts, he truly hoped for a naval evacuation, but the pirates took his payment and vanished, possibly on Rome's orders or out of sheer greed. The fleet Spartacus counted on never arrived. He was trapped in Apulia, at the heel of Italy, surrounded by an ever-tightening ring. His army, tired of endless marches, increasingly asked one question: what next? Some sources claim Spartacus suggested his soldiers disperse into small groups, hide, and survive on their own. He himself decided to stay with the core, those who were ready to fight to the end. The men who had been with him from Capua, Vesuvius, Lucania, the north and south of Italy. For them this was no longer just a rebellion. It was a path, a choice. And if it ended here, it would not be in flight. Nevertheless, he made one last attempt to break out, this time by land, moving northwest. But Crassus would not allow it. He ordered the construction of a massive line of fortifications, ditches, ramparts, and walls stretching nearly 60 miles, cutting off the south of Italy from the rest. He had cornered Spartacus. No food, no supplies, no exit. All that remained was a breakout, and Spartacus charged, in winter, through rain and mud, against the fortifications. It was less a battle than an act of survival. Warriors attacked with broken shields, frozen hands, and no sleep, but they broke through. He managed to lead about a third of his army out. But they were not saved. The final phase began. Crassus pursued the survivors relentlessly, giving them no time to regroup or rest. Each day, Spartacus's army dwindled, dying from hunger, wounds, and skirmishes with cavalry. Meanwhile, a new threat approached: Gnaeus Pompey Magnus. The Senate, fearing Crassus's growing popularity, summoned Pompey from Spain. Pompey, the victor over Sertorius, marched with an army of veterans, eager to claim the glory of ending the war. The silent rivalry began between Crassus and Pompey. Both wanted to be the one to finish it. Spartacus was caught between them. He tried to turn back towards the Lucanian mountains, where they might still hide. He moved slowly, leading an army that now lacked food and weapons. Many fighters were wounded, their feet wrapped in rags. Women, children, the elderly, Spartacus had abandoned no one. On the slopes of Lucania, he stopped. The final camp, the final night. He knew Rome would offer no negotiations, no terms, no mercy. He knew Crassus would be upon them soon, and Pompey would be waiting to finish off any survivors. Only one option remained: to meet the enemy face to face. Not to run, not to surrender, but to fight. Before the final battle, it is said he killed his own horse. It was a symbol. There was no retreat. Now it was either victory or death. He addressed his men, declaring that no one would be taken prisoner, no one would be crucified. None of them would end their lives on a cross by the roadside. This fight would not be for victory, but for the right to die as men.
The final battle and the death of a hero. Spring, 71 BC. Lucania, the southern extremity of Italy, where mountains give way to plains, and the land lies open and vulnerable. It was here, in the valley by the river Silarus, that the story, which began in a gladiator school with stolen knives, was to end. In 2 years, Spartacus's army had traversed almost all of Italy, won dozens of victories, challenged the Senate and the legions, but now it stood before its end. The path back was cut. The deal with the pirates had failed. The Alps remained out of reach. The men were exhausted, supplies were gone, faith was fading. Yet, despite everything, Spartacus had preserved the core of his army, those prepared to meet death as openly as they had once embraced freedom. The final camp was pitched in the lowlands by the river. No fortress, no walls, no natural cover. Just people, weary, wounded, hungry, but unbroken. They knew the enemy would come by morning, knew there was nowhere left to retreat. And yet, no one left. No one tried to flee, hide, or surrender. Even those who could barely stand remained. They did not expect victory. They wanted to meet their end on their own terms. Spartacus had, by various accounts, around 30,000 people. Only half had proper weapons. The rest held whatever could serve as one: wooden clubs, broken spear shafts, metal bars, even just stones. Crassus's army numbered no fewer than 40,000 well-equipped, trained legionaries, formed into an iron military machine where there was no room for emotion or doubt, only duty and orders. Crassus approached the battle with cold calculation. He understood that another failure would destroy his reputation and political future. He arranged his army in multiple lines, strengthened the flanks, positioned cavalry on the open ground, and held reserves in the rear. His plan was simple: absorb the charge, hold the onslaught, then close the ring and let no one escape. According to legend, before the battle, Spartacus gathered his comrades, thanked them for the journey they had shared, and then killed his horse. This gesture was not of despair, but of choice. He would fight on foot, alongside everyone else, and would not leave the field even if all was lost. He left himself no path for retreat. When the battle began at dawn, the field was filled with the cries of men, the clash of weapons, the thunder of shields. The rebels attacked first with desperate fury, with the intensity born of knowing this was the final chance. The first line of legionaries wavered. In some places, Spartacus broke through. He fought in the front ranks personally, inspiring his warriors. He was wounded in the thigh, but fought on. According to Plutarch, he tried to reach Crassus himself for a duel, but was surrounded. Despite a second wound to his shoulder, he fought until his strength finally left him. After the battle, Spartacus's body was never found or identified. In the chaos of the corpse-strewn field, he vanished. There was no triumphant display of his body, no order to preserve it for a trophy. To the Romans, he was an enemy. But to history, he became something more, a symbol of resistance, a man who refused to submit until his very last moment. Crassus's victory was total. The remnants of the army, about 6,000 men, were captured. They were given no trial, no chance to become slaves again. Their fate was different. By Crassus's order, all 6,000 were crucified along the Appian Way, the main artery between Capua and Rome. Every step, every mile of that road was now lined with bodies. The crosses stood at regular intervals as a warning. This display of horror was designed to instill fear. Those who passed by were meant to see Rome does not forgive those who rebel against its order. The bodies hung for a long time, unburied, a part of the landscape, a part of memory. Crassus expected to be welcomed in Rome as a hero, but the Senate, wary of his growing power, also hailed Pompey, who had mopped up the last stragglers. Pompey rushed to claim that it was he who had truly finished the war. Officially, they triumphed. Spartacus had lost, but Rome could not claim a true victory. It had destroyed the army, but it could not destroy what it symbolized.
The aftermath. After the battle at the Silarus, the rebellion was officially declared crushed. Rome rejoiced. The enemy was destroyed. Order restored. Crassus's army returned victorious. But behind the outward calm, cracks remained. For 2 years, Italy had lived in fear, not of an external invasion, but of those it had considered mere property. The army of slaves had proven that fear could turn to rage, that the powerless could fight, that even in chains, a man could remain free inside. Immediately after the victory, Rome took measures. Security was tightened in gladiator schools. Rural areas were pacified. Slaveholding methods were reviewed. But these were merely cosmetic attempts to patch over an obvious truth. A system built on slavery is vulnerable. It relies on violence, but cannot guarantee submission. Politically, the victory served both Crassus and Pompey. Both gained recognition, strengthened their positions in the Senate, and would soon form an alliance with the young, not yet influential Julius Caesar. But in the shadow of this new political era, the name of Spartacus did not disappear. It continued to resonate not as a threat, but as a shadow, an image that even the most powerful state is not immune to internal explosion. Ancient authors, recounting these events, did not seek to idealize Spartacus. Appian, Plutarch, Florus, Sallust all wrote from a Roman perspective, seeing the rebels primarily as a threat. But even in their texts, a note of respect is palpable. Spartacus is not depicted as a mere barbarian or monster. He is a dangerous but intelligent enemy, not a rebel with a stick, but a commander capable of outmaneuvering legions. Particularly in Plutarch's parallel lives, the figure of Spartacus takes on an almost tragic depth, a man born not for the arena, but for something greater, whom his era denied a chance. Over time, Spartacus became a symbol. His name was taken up not by historians, but by poets, philosophers, and revolutionaries. In the Middle Ages, he was nearly forgotten, but starting in the 15th century, and especially with the French Revolution, he became a hero for those fighting tyranny. In the 19th century, Karl Marx called him the most brilliant figure of antiquity. In the 20th century, his name became a symbol for entire movements, from socialists to anti-racism fighters. In the USSR, films were made about him. In Germany, a revolutionary organization was named after him, the Spartacus League. Perhaps the biggest impact on popular perception came from cinema. In 1960, Stanley Kubrick's film Spartacus, starring Doug Kirkless, showed him not just as a fighter, but as a man who desired love, dignity, and peace. The line, "I'm Spartacus," became a universal symbol of solidarity. The myth was firmly cemented. Even if we do not know what Spartacus looked like or how his voice sounded, even if the details of the rebellion are lost in conflicting sources, we sense that he was not just a man. He became an image,
an image of resistance, endurance, and human dignity. Rome won, but could not forget. The empire vanished, the roads crumbled, the crosses turned to dust, but the name of Spartacus has survived into the digital age, a reminder for all times. He proved that even those the world considers nothing can change the course of history, not with a sword, a crown, or a title, but with will alone. That is why he is remembered, not as a slave, but as a free man.